for coming out tonight. We're really excited to have tonight's speaker. Our speaker tonight is the founder of Evolve, Move, Play, as well as the co-founder of Parkour Vision in Seattle. He's a researcher focused on an evolutionary approach to movement and fitness, and has been a movement coach for over 12 years. He's considered one of the top parkour coaches in the world and teaches seminars on free running and natural movement exercises with a deep love of nature and play. So if you can all help me welcome Rafe Kelly.
Thank you very much. So as she said, my name is Rafe Kelly, and I'm the founder of a movement method called Embodied Play. So when people ask me what I do, it's always kind of a hard question to answer. And the best way that I can describe it is that I try to teach people how to move like a human being. So I want to get deeply into kind of the concept of what that means. What does it mean to move like a human being? But before we get there, I want to go deeper into the overall idea of living like a human being and kind of the problem that we face in the West. And before we do that, I want to invite you guys to make a step towards moving and living more like a human being right now. So I know you all registered to be able to sit down, but if you feel comfortable with it, I'd like you to take your chair and put it in the back and choose to sit on the ground.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Awesome. Now that you're all down on the ground, I want to talk to you guys about the interesting paradox that we face in the West right now. Because in many ways, we live in the world that is the best world that's ever existed. People are more affluent today. We're safer, we're more secure, we're less likely to suffer real physical ailments than maybe any time in the past. We're less likely to be murdered, less likely to be assaulted, less likely to have our property taken from us, less likely to have an epidemic disease, less likely to lose our children to epidemic disease. In many ways, things are really awesome. But on the flip side, we are disconnected from our bodies. We're disconnected from traditional communities that we had. We're disconnected from practices that sustained our health, and we have epidemics of obesity. So I'm from the States, so all these statistics are based on the States. They're a little different in Canada, but broadly similar. In the States, over 1/3 of everybody is suffering obesity. The majority of Americans are either obese or overweight. We have epidemic rates of depression and anxiety. And as long as we've been studying happiness and well-being, we've had a steady downward trend. So there's bumps, right? After the depression, happiness went up relatively. But overall, the trend has been downwards. People live in a world where they have more opportunity, more luxury than we've ever had, and yet that they're less happy than they've ever been. 1 out of 4 American women is on some sort of prescription psychiatric medication. Think about that. 25% of American women have some sort of psychiatric medication.
I think that's our fault.
There's a great song in America played in Canada. But,
I think he meant men. Yeah, totally.
on the male side, men are falling behind economically, we're falling behind academically, and little boys are being put on Adderall and Ritalin at incredible rates just to keep them functional in schools. So there's a problem, and I think that this paradox really boils down to the problem of mismatch between our evolved nature and the environment that we live in. We've created a world that's so unlike any world that we've had in the past that it doesn't fit our genes. And we have created all these benefits for ourselves, but we haven't recognized the costs that associate with them, and we haven't figured out ways to bear those costs, to alleviate those costs. So I'm not a romantic about the past. I think that there's a ton to learn from it, but I don't want to go back to living in a world where about 30% of my male friends and family would be murdered or die in warfare over their life. I don't want to go back to living in a world where about the same number of my female kin would be kidnapped or raped. I don't want to go back to living in a world where my 2 children, who are 3.5 and 20 months old, have about a 50% chance of making it to 15 years old. Right? I don't want to go back to a world where my own lifespan is only going to be about 20 more years, and I'm likely to die from disease. there are many, many things that are really beneficial about the West that we live in, and we should appreciate those. We just have to start alleviating and understanding how it's not matching up with our ancestral nature. I want to talk about also, we have these epidemics of what that I think are undiagnosed. So people being essentially motor retarded. People cannot
retarded?
motor, their movement capacities are retarded. We can't move. We can't squat, right? We can't do pull-ups. Right? When the standards for the U.S. Marines for doing pull-ups used to be 15 pull-ups. Now it's 2. Right? What? These are the most elite physical people, right? Standards for LEO, standards for firemen are being slashed across the board because people just can't physically do what a human being should do anymore. We have physical weakness, we have uncoordination, and we have disconnection from ourselves, from our bodies, from each other. So this is the problem of ancestral mismatch. Now, how many of you guys are on the paleo diet or have experimented with the paleo diet or are familiar with that? Almost everybody, right? Okay, good. So it's based on a really simple idea, right? Human beings evolved to eat a specific diet, right? And when we eat diets that are further and further away from that, our health tends to suffer. And that makes sense. If you take any animal out of the wild and feed it a diet that's very far from what it ate in the wild, it's likely to suffer some sort of physical problems. I think that there's some problems with the prescriptions of the paleo diet specifically, but I think the overall thesis absolutely stands, and I think the biggest problem is that people aren't stretching far enough. There's a great old saying, which is, man does not live by bread alone. Whether you're eating bread or not, the saying stands because what they're saying is that food is not the only way that we nourish our bodies. It's not the only way that we cultivate ourselves. And if your perspective around health is solely about food, then you're missing a huge amount of the picture of what actually makes a human being thrive and feel healthy and well. So my big focus is movement. And I'm going to get into why I think movement is such an important aspect of how we cultivate healthy, vibrant human beings. But I wanted to continue to kind of look at the overall picture just a little bit before we get there. One of my favorite authors is Katie Bowman. How many of you guys are familiar with Katie Bowman? So she has this term, movement nutrition. Essentially, every time you move your body, every time you move through different positions, when you load the cells, you have neurohormonal responses. You have biochemicals moving through your body based on the way that it's loaded. And in the same way that your body is unhealthy if it's not getting the food and the nutrients from food that it needs, it's unhealthy if it's not being nourished by movement the way that it needs to. And this is not just true, I believe, of movement, but it's true in a much broader sense. In dietary circles, there's a concept known as nutrientism. So, anyone familiar with this? So nutrientism was this idea that came out when we first started kind of studying what was in food. We discovered macronutrients, we discovered calories, we discovered vitamins and minerals. And scientists started to believe that they could synthesize diets that were superior to any traditional diet by finding the optimal amounts of these individual nutrients. And they got to the point where they said to women, we're going to make a formula that's superior than breast milk for the health of your babies. That was a bad idea. That was a terrible idea. And it didn't work. And it turns out that we are very far from actually understanding all of the nutrients that are in the food that we eat and all the ways that they interact with each other. So the model of we're going to figure out the individual nutrients and then hack the system to make it better than a traditional diet has largely failed. And I think that we face that problem of trying to reduce things to too small of variables and missing the broader picture in a lot of the ways that we look at health and movement, as we'll get into. A really simple example of this that I like to give is vitamin D. How many of you guys have been told that you should be on vitamin D supplementation? A Lots, okay. We live in the Northwest. You guys, it's a little bit nicer here than the rest of us in the Northwest, but we all are supposed to be sun deprived, right? So we can think of the sun as a traditional nourishment, right? And vitamin D is the proposed scientific mechanism for what the benefits of the sun are for you. The sun is good for you because you synthesize vitamin D from it. But it's bad for you because it gives you cancer, so take vitamin D and don't get sun exposure. No, sorry, it doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. It turns out that as we've started to study deeper, it looks like there's 10 or more photogenic nutrients that are developed by the body when exposed to the sun. And we don't know how all those nutrients play into each other and give us the benefits that we see from people who have sun exposure. There's a recent study that came out that found that people who have the least sun exposure relative to people who have the most sun exposure have an increased cancer risk similar to smoking, right? So smoking cigarettes is similarly bad to your health as not getting sun exposure. And we don't know all of the ways that sun exposure is good for you. So vitamin D supplementation, it might be something that will help you, but don't think that it's replacing what the sun gives you. And this is something that we need to think about in all the ways that we're trying to kind of hack the system. So how do we avoid this trap of nutrients, of getting lost in isolating things and lost in reductionism? Reductionism is one of the most powerful systems of developing knowledge that has ever existed, but it's another one of those. We got a lot of benefit, and then we got some negatives that we didn't necessarily recognize. How do we avoid that? So we need to take this broader ancestral health perspective. And we're going to get into that more, but it's even more insidious than that, because it's not just that we're trying to figure out these nutrients and reducing them down beyond the point where they're actually most nutritious. It's also that there's a perverse incentive structure to produce things that are stimulating without being nourishing. A good friend of mine, Stefan Guillenet, he's a neurobiology PhD and a researcher on obesity. And he said to me something once which really stuck in my head. He said that what the food industry has done is they've systematically divorced flavor from nutrition. So think about that for a second. What that means is, in the past, if you wanted to experience sweetness, you had to eat something like fruit that was packed with phytonutrients and vitamins and minerals and sugar, water and fiber. So there was a ton of nutrition that was just part of getting sweet. But now you can have candy. Candy doesn't have any of those things. And it started the gears kind of working in my head, and I started thinking to myself, if junk food is flavor doors for nutrition, what are video games? Video games are thrill divorced from physicality. So now you can jump from building to building. You can shoot a bunch of bad guys. You can hunt. You can defeat the enemy without ever breaking a sweat, without ever leaving your couch, without ever stopping sitting. Right? What is pornography? Right? Pornography is divorcing sexual pleasure from the context of relationships. So I'm married. I've been with my wife for 13 years. And like everybody in relationships, we've had our struggles. We've had difficulties, you know. And when I look back on it, I think that those difficult journeys with my wife are probably the most powerful lessons that I've learned in becoming a better human being. So when we create a way for people to just get the fun without all the work, we're taking away a lot of the nourishment, a lot of the self-development. I don't think anybody thinks to themselves, man, I've gained so much in my life from eating candy, or from, you know, I'm a better person because I beat Halo, or, you know, all those hours on Pornhub. That is really the definition of who I am as a person. I'm a hero because of that, you know. So why are we letting ourselves spend so much time on these things? What it looks like to me is unintentionally, I don't think that this is necessarily like an evil conspiracy. It's just a byproduct of the way capitalism works. You win at capitalism by being able to get people to have a hyper-rewarding experience on some ancestral reward pathway in your brain. Your brain evolved to seek sweet so it would get fruit. It evolved to seek sexuality so it would have children. Right? It evolved to, seek thrill so that you could have the strength and ability in your body to hunt and protect yourself and fight. And if we can kind of hack the reward system as a corporation and deliver a very high level of stimulation as cheaply as possible, then we have a strong profit-making potential, right? Fruit doesn't store very long. It's difficult to grow, and it's susceptible to crop failure. And when people eat fruit, they get full, and they don't eat very much of it. Candy, on the other hand, triggers overeating. It's based on cheap ingredients. You can manufacture it basically all the time. So it's a much more effective profit generator. So even, it doesn't need to be an intention that it destroys people's health. It's just a byproduct of an effective profit generation. And I don't say this to damn capitalism. I'm not like a big-time socialist. I think capitalism is one of the reasons why we have all those benefits. Right? Capitalism is why we have the spread of trade that prevents war. It's why we have, or it's part of why we have modern medicine. It's part of why we have all these benefits. But again, we've changed the system so fast that we haven't noticed the costs and haven't started to address them. We need to go back. We don't need to go back to the Paleolithic, but we need to take a moment to realize what we've lost as we transition forward. So I'm going to get into the movement stuff, but I wanted to just take a little bit more time to really go over this broader cultural picture of what we've lost. When I was 10 years old, I had a mentor, and he took me to visit his family in the Appalachian region. So his family were the Staffords, and the Staffords had lived in this town, which was called Staffordville after them. There was the Irish settlement, and then it was Staffordsville. They lived there since the 18th century. So we drive all the way up to the very corner of the end of Virginia, right next to North Carolina. Drive out on this dirt road and come to a log-built cabin that had been built by my mentor's grandfather. And when we got there, there was a big clan together, and they were all preparing a feast for us. And his aunt took me out into the woods, and we harvested sarsaparilla to make tea with. So we come back, and we sit down to the feast, and before we sit down, his grandfather stands up and quotes extemporaneously from the Bible for 15 minutes. He had the whole thing memorized. And the food that we ate was centered around a ham that had been raised, butchered, and cured by one of his great uncles. And there was trout from a local stream that had been caught by one of his uncles. There was fry bed that had been made from scratch right there. There was fried chicken from scratch. There was pies from scratch. I mean, the list goes on. They were really great cooks. And when they were done with the feast, they brought out accordions and fiddles and guitars. And they sang dozens of traditional songs. And I was just immensely impressed by how much culture these people had. John's great-grandfather had been the traveling doctor for that whole region before the first hospitals came into the region. And he'd been the pastor for that region as well. And so he'd taken his sons with him, and they had traveled around. And when they grew up, they actually developed a folk band and traveled the country singing Appalachian folk music before they then went and fought in World War II. So all these old guys were fit and strong. They were incredibly confident across an enormous range of things that we've always kind of needed to be confident in culturally. And they were kind of the most profound group of elders I'd ever seen who had that sense of really being complete human beings. Now there's a sad coda to this, because when I was 16, I went back to visit his family, and in the interim, basically, that whole oldest generation had all passed away. And so when we came back, there was no more food that had been really gathered. All the food came from Walmart, except for one guy in the family was a hunter. And nobody would sing the songs. There was one girl in the family who was still singing the traditional songs. And sadly, she just got out of rehab, and she'd be in prison a few months after I came to visit. The social world that they talked about, instead of being about all the stories of all the kind of amazing events of giant snakes that they found in the woods and all these things, that had kind of collapsed to talking about meeting people at Walmart. And all the old guys were strong and fit. They all had solid marriages. There was no drug or alcohol abuse. John's grandfather had a gin bottle that he hid in a Bible, but he never drank it to excess. And in the succeeding generations, almost everybody had gone obese or had developed overweight. There's a lot of sexual abuse. There's a lot of spousal abuse. A lot of broken relationships. And like I said, everyone was orienting their food around Walmart. And I was already really interested in anthropology at the time. And I realized that what I had seen basically was the death of a culture. Right? For 200 years, these people had been living in this area and had a deep relationship with the land, with their community, with everything. And they essentially had modernized. They had gotten all this new modern stuff that came in, and it wiped out that traditional culture. People no longer saw the skills and the values of that older generation as being relevant. And what replaced it didn't have nearly the same value for them. And we see this trend over and over again. When a traditional culture dies, it tends to kind of impoverish people. And we see this with First Nations, with Australian Aborigines, with African tribes, and in this case with Appalachian hillbillies. So I've thought a lot about that over the years, and I look at those people, and I really think that they represent a lot of what we're trying to get back now, what we're trying to cultivate as a culture. Another one of my good friends in the movement community is a thinker named Frank Forencich, and he has this beautiful description of health. He says it's not just mind, body, and spirit. It's actually mind, body, spirit, land, tribe, and ancestors. So if we think about that generation of elders, they were deeply religious. I'm not a Christian myself, I'm sort of an atheist, but I really respect how that affected their lives and how deeply they were committed to that religion. They were all physically strong. John's grandfather, the day before he died, he was chopping down a tree by hand. These guys had all fought in a war. They could fight, they could hunt, they could fish, they could chop down, How many of you guys are familiar with Robert Heinlein's quote about specializations for insects? Sorry, I should have had that written down so I could read it to you, but it's great. These are the things that a human being should be able to do, and these guys could all do it. And in a sense, each of them was an almost complete repository of their culture. And I think one of the things that's really driving the paradox of our modern insecurity is that we have the most knowledgeable culture in general ever, but each individual is the narrowest repository of that. If you think of your culture as all of the different skill sets that exist within your culture, how do we acquire food? How many of you guys can take care of acquiring food for yourself? How do we make shelters? How many of you guys know how to build your own houses? How do we, take care of medicine? All these guys knew herbal medicines. So your woodscraft, your agriculture, all these things are part of our culture. And what's happened is that we have become narrower and narrower spectrums of that. We're little worker bees who sit in offices and do one thing to make money. And then we use that money to prevent us from having to have any of the other competencies. So we pay for other people to play music for us. We pay for other people to make our food for us. We pay for other people to raise our children for us. And what I believe happens is that this produces a profound kind of alienation from your self-identity. we have this epidemic of self-esteem problems. And I don't think it's because we need to tell everyone you need self-esteem and you're beautiful and you're unique and you're a snowflake. I think it's because the reason that we have this problem is because we don't have cultivated selves that are worth esteem. If you want self-esteem, help people develop selves that are complete, that are real, full human beings. So why movement, right? Why is moving like a human such a profound place to start in this quest for becoming a more human human, a more embodied, alive, more complete, living like a human being? So one thing I point out is that if you look at self-cultivation cultures from around the world, you'll find that they're often rooted in and start with a physical cultivation practice. So Kung Fu, you guys are familiar with Kung Fu, it doesn't mean martial arts. It means good work. It means self-cultivation, right? And traditional schools of Kung Fu are almost all associated with Buddhism or Taoism or Muslim religious traditions and self-cultivation and philosophical traditions in China. If you look at the Stoics in European history, there is a huge emphasis on cultivating the body. The Western world has fallen into this trap of thinking of the mind as separate from the body. Descartes' dualism, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This is who we are. This is just the thing that bears us through the world. And it's a false dualism. The brain, actually the majority of it, works to control the body. Brains come into existence to control complex movement apparatuses in evolution. And the brain is not separated from the body. The nervous system is contiguous throughout the body. And what's happening in the individual tissues is feeding back to the mind all the time. You hold emotions in tissues. You have emotional centers in your heart, in your belly, and all throughout you. If you feel tension, your face changes. Your scalene's tense. All these things happen to you. You can't separate them. We don't have a body and a mind, we have a body and a mind. And movement is probably the easiest path to start kind of developing a good relationship with the whole thing. If we think about it, when we're alive, we're moving. If you're completely still, you're dead, right? Cells move, that's how they do things, that's how they process things. You're breathing, your blood is pumping, you're moving from the moment that you take your first breath to the moment you take your last breath. So your choice in this life is to move well and develop yourself through movement, or not to. And if we look at children, they're inherently driven to move. They move all the time. They're constantly wanting to explore and see how their bodies can move. And I don't think this drive truly just dissipates with age. I think it's killed by our culture. It's killed by a culture that says, don't run, don't jump, don't climb, don't roughhouse. Sit still for 6 to 8 hours a day, and then do your homework, and then do your extracurricular activities. When we are divorced from the nutrition of movement, our bodies start to fail. Just like if we're divorced from nutrition of food. So we have developed this paradigm of exercise and fitness. You don't move, you don't act like a human being, you don't do human things, so you need to replace that with exercise. And what this is basically nutrientism applied to the body. We've tried to isolate a few things about how a healthy human body functions, and we have fallen into the trap of thinking that that's the whole story. So I believe that if you think you're developing a healthy body through a movement diet of jogging, bodybuilding, and stretching, that's sort of like thinking that you're going to get a healthy diet from cornstarch, whey protein, and water. You've got your macronutrients covered, but you're missing the vast majority of what actually nourishes a human body. Every cell in your body responds to being loaded. Every cell in your body responds to being loaded. Your nervous system is constantly reacting to the information that it gets from the body. If you're not stimulating that, you're letting it atrophy, and you're growing weaker and less resilient and less adaptable over time. So how have we forgotten this? Right? How have we come to live in a culture where we've forgotten the second most fundamental thing behind breathing to being alive? I think that the movement was such a prominent part of people's lives in the past that we didn't often even understand what it was. I think of it as cultural substructure. I had a video I made last year called The Waterfall, I Move Like a Human Being. And it features me climbing through a tunnel in a waterfall. So I showed this to my dad. And my dad turns to me and says, Rafe, that must have been really scary going up through the waterfall. I only ever went down. I was flabbergasted. I was like, what? Like, this waterfall is 45 minutes from the town that my dad grew up in. And it was like this secret place that my buddy had shown me. It was this huge act of courage for us to learn to climb through this waterfall. And come to find out my dad had been doing it with his buddies when they were teenagers. My dad never had a name for all of the things that he did, but he climbed trees, he ran and jumped over canyons in the woods, he was flipping into water, he was physically active, he was a collegiate football player and 5th in state in wrestling. And the funny thing is he's kind of never, like, it's been really hard for him to understand how I've crafted a career out of movement. But as I've moved from gymnastics to urban parkour to natural movement, slowly people are starting to tell me all these stories about it. Like, oh yeah, your dad used to climb up trees and slide down the outsides of the cedar trees. I was like, wait, how does that work? I don't understand how that works. So I went to my dad and I was like, what are these people talking about? Eventually, like, I kind of get this idea in my head, and I was able to go back to my training and climb up a cedar tree and go to the outer limbs and sort of slide down them. It's super cool, super rad. And so I'm learning from my elders, from my ancestors. And so it's come out over time. But what happened, right? Because I didn't do those things that he did. Like, I lived at the end of a dirt road in a hippie community and got a lot more movement than most people growing up. But I didn't go to the same level of it as my dad did. Because I was kind of alone. Right? Like, by the time I was 10, 11 years old, all my friends were more interested in playing video games and watching TV and smoking marijuana, doing all these things. And so we didn't push each other. I was kind of like the only kid in the woods trying to figure it out on my own. And my dad didn't perceive it as something that needed to be passed on. Right? It was one of these cultural things that existed. It was just frivolous kid stuff, right? It was just the way that kids entertained themselves in the era before TV, in the era before video games, in the era before even, they didn't even really have the radio they did. So we've lost something, and we need to reclaim it. We need to understand what it is we've lost. I come from the parkour community, and I think parkour is really interesting because, in a sense, what parkour did was they said, the way that every kid interacts with nature, we're going to reimagine the city as an environment that we can do the same things to. So all kids will want to climb trees, but we don't have the same kind of inherent attraction to walls. So parkour is like this radical reimagining of the urban world as being available for play the way the natural world is. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. The problem is that they got so interested in the urban world that they forgot the root of it was from the natural world. And when we don't kind of nourish ourselves with the most fundamental traditional nourishments, there's something that gets missed. So how many of you guys practice parkour or CrossFit or gymnastic strength or any sort of barbell calisthenics-based training? Okay, almost good. So I want you to look at your hand right now. You'll see that there's a line of callus across the top of your hand right below your fingers. You guys see that? Now, how callous is the skin just below that? Pretty nice and soft? So if you look at my hand, you'll see that it's one callus from here to there. Now it's a little bit more developed here, but it's continuous. Because I don't primarily train on any of those things. I primarily train on trees and rocks. I'm pushing and lifting and carrying and pulling myself on trees and rocks. So every surface that my hand interacts with is a little bit different. It's incredibly diverse. So my hand's getting loaded all over. Why is that important? Well, essentially, when you have a callus here, that's trained skin. And when you have soft skin next to it, that's essentially sedentary skin. That skin's just not getting loaded. It's not getting trained. So you have a problem of proportional weakness. You have strong tissues next to weak tissues. So you rip, not because you have a callus, you rip because you don't have a callus next to the callus. You don't have an even distribution of strength over the skin of your hand. So I rarely rip when I'm training. And when I do rip, it's usually only the outer layer of callus on the hand. It never goes deep into the skin underneath the hand. So often I'll rip and I'll hardly feel the blister. This is a really important concept because it's a huge problem with the modern strength and conditioning, with the whole idea of fitness that we have. One of my clients is a PT for the Seattle Seahawks, and so we talk a lot about what's happening in the NFL, and this is true in any sports team I follow. But injury rates are going up. We have the strongest, fastest, most powerful, most intensely trained generation of athletes that have ever existed, and yet injury rates are going up. There's an informal statistic that I've seen that ACL tears in the NFL have increased, they have tripled in the last decade. Think about that. Achilles tendon tears have gone from a once-in-a-lifetime freak injury to a regular occurrence on every team in the NFL. So why is that happening? Essentially, we're overdosing on certain movement nutrients while not getting the broad kind of movement nutrition that we need. So if you train in the off season and you're doing your bilateral squats, and that's how you're developing your quads, that's only one line of tissue. That's only one relationship of tissue through your legs. And so you develop this incredibly powerful muscle, and at the same time, the knee is not getting loaded, the ligaments and the tendons are not getting loaded in all the different directions. And so when they have to fire from a compromised position, that big muscle is now pulling on a ligament that hasn't been conditioned, that isn't strong. And so you get the same effect as that line of callus on the hands, pulling on the soft sedentary skin. Pop, you have an MCL tear, an ACL tear, and a meniscus tear. We think that we're making ourselves healthy through these isolated movement practices. But a lot of times, people are actually injuring themselves. Runners get like 80% of run drivers are injured every year. Running is great. I'm not saying running isn't good. Running is a fundamental human movement nutrient. But when it's out of balance with everything else, it's basically a malnutrition problem and you get hurt. So, what does it mean to move like a human being? What does it mean to move like a human being? This is actually a really interesting and difficult question for us to ask, because we are, all of us, in a cage. We're all of us sort of in a bizarro world of movement. Katie Bowman has a great analogy about this. She talks about flop-finned orcas. It was really cool because I was going to talk to you guys about this today. And on the ferry over, I saw a pod of orcas. It was the first time I'd ever seen them in the wild. Beautiful. And there was a male orca there, and it had a really big fin. Well, male orcas develop bigger fins as a secondary sexual characteristic. It's a way of sort of demonstrating their big masculinity. When male orcas develop in captivity, when that fin expands, it flops over. It develops something called floppy fin syndrome. So why do they develop these floppy fins? Well, orcas in captivity don't get to dive deeply. Orcas in the wild dive very deep. The fin is not a muscle, it's not a bone, it's made out of connective tissue, and it adapts by being loaded. So it's the pressure of diving deep into the ocean that gives the fin the loading that makes it develop robusticity and strength. In addition, orcas in the ocean swim in every direction, but orcas in captivity habitually swim only counterclockwise. So they go lap after lap after lap, trying to exercise themselves because they're going insane, swimming in the same direction. So over time, that asymmetrical force pulls the fin over. Well, I would posit to you that essentially everybody who's trying to think about human movement in the West is like a fluff into orca, looking at all the other fluff into orca saying, what does it mean? How do we develop this? Well, the scientists looking at this. So I come from an anthropology background, evolutionary biology background, and when I first started discovering parkour, I felt like there was something primal about it, something that was bigger than fitness, bigger than gymnastics, which is what I had been doing. And I was reading a lot of ethnographic literature, and I was seeing the same trends about movement happening, the same types of play happening all over the world. And so I've tried to root my method ever since then and understand how human beings are supposed to move, how human beings develop to move through cross-cultural studies, through evolutionary biology, through ethology, and looking at how other animals move. And the fundamental insight is that play is kind of the root of movement. Mammals learn to move and become competent in movement through play, right? Before a cat ever has to catch its prey for real, it's played out those roles, those physical skills, hundreds of thousands of times. And every species moves in ways that are specific to the tasks that they've always needed. Right? So cats stalk and pounce and grapple and bite because that's how they catch their prey. And dogs love to play games of chase and tug of war and dissect things with their mouths because that's how wolves run down to catch their prey. So if you look across all cultures, you'll find that small humans and adult humans, when they have a chance, they're not overly tired, will engage in games of chase and tag. We're predators too. Right? They'll sneak up on each other. My kids love it when they sneak up on them. It scares them. They will climb trees and rocks. We come from 60 million years of arboreal movement. Right? We have binocular vision and grasping hands and shoulders that can do all these funny things because we come from evolution in the trees. We are incredibly attracted to moving in trees, and it's something we see all over the world. We build forts. We swing sticks and rocks and throw them. Right? These are really important skills for hunting. We love to wrestle and box and dance and practice acrobatics. It's an interesting thing. Like, people don't think of acrobatics as a natural movement thing, but I was incredibly impressed by reading ethnographic literature and hearing about kids swinging on liana vines. Look at the biggest, the Mbuti pygmy in the Congo. Look at the biggest guy in the village to grab a liana vine and swing it in a circle, and the kids will grab onto it and do front flips off of it. So all over the world, people do this. So these are the fundamental things that the human movement adaptation kind of contains. We like them, and they're fun for us because we're supposed to do them. We need them. And we've tried to replace them with exercise. And it's not working, it's not making us healthy, but it's also not making us happy. Right? Exercise is miserable. The exercise and fitness industry, is a $6 billion enterprise in the States. And yet we live in a time when people are weaker, they're fatter, they're more immobile, they're less enduring, and they have more physical pain than they've ever had. Right? We're pouring billions of dollars into fitness and exercise, and for the vast majority, the result is, if anything, negative. It's just feeling bad about your body. I believe it's time that we fire fitness. Just throw it out. We need to go back to applying the concept of movement and this ancestral health paradigm to how a human body needs to move. We need to rediscover joy and love and play in how we approach our lives. And we need to do this in the natural world. This is really important to me, and I think it's really important to understand. Our bodies evolve in nature, and nature is not, it's not replicable by the environment. Right? I see all these beautiful things happening in this broader thing called movement culture now, and it's great, but it's missing its context. Right? There's all these guys doing these beautiful quadrupedal movement patterns. But why does a human being do quadrupedal movement? Is it to impress somebody moving on a nice floor like this? Or is it because that's how a human being solves a steep slope or moves through a tight canopy in the trees? And when we try to replace the real original nourishment that the human body needs with this isolated version of it, we're not getting everything, because the proprioceptive information, the kinesthetic feedback, the way that the body's loaded, the ability to deal with all these chaotic variables that you're experiencing when you're on that, sliding down that slope on all fours, that's not replicated when you're in the gym. It's far less nutritious. And it goes beyond those physiological and skill things as well, because the natural environment feeds us in many ways. So if we root our physical practice in the natural environment, not only are we going to build a better overall movement capacity, we're going to be healthier human beings in general. You're more microbe than you are human being. And one of the big sources for human microbes is supposed to be microbes that are in the soil, right? We're supposed to be dirty a lot. Dirt. And what they found is that the microbes in forest soils have mood elevating effects. Right? It's like taking drugs to prevent your depression. The trees release phytochemicals that have mood elevating effects. So you're supposed to breathe the breath of the trees. That's medicine for a human being. That's nourishment for a human being. There are studies that find that walking through a green space has a similar effect on your ability to exert willpower and pay attention as if you had just taken a nap. Right? And there's this great term that was coined by E.O. Wilson, biophilia. Human beings have an innate love of nature. So I got into gymnastics when I was 15, 18 years old, and I started teaching gymnastics so that I could be in the gym and play and do all the fun stuff that I like. And over the years, I've gone into natural movement, and now people can't get me into the gym. Like I co-founded a parkour gym in Seattle, and people are always like, "Oh, there's this event going on." I'd like to come. I really would, but I could be outside, because when I go train in the little park by my house, I get to watch the sunset over the Olympics, and I get to watch the bald eagles flying overhead, and the ospreys. And this whole winter, I was swimming in the ocean, and there was a heron that would fly down and fish right next to me while I was swimming. Right now, there's pileated woodpeckers coming in, and the crows are starting to nest and gather up their resources. So they're always kind of chatting at each other and yelling at me to make sure that I'm not getting into their trees. So you get to watch these things and get deeply into it. Some of my students are wilderness awareness school students, so they're now introducing me into how you can listen to the voices of the birds and start to hear the story of the forest. This is all available to you while you're doing your physical practice. So natural movement is so much more nourishing than fitness, or even just an idea of movement culture. And it's the start of a really powerful pathway to self-cultivation. I believe in meditation, I believe in some of these other things, but if you don't have a good relationship with your body, I think it's really hard to get to the point where you can be still enough to focus on developing your mind. If you don't have a good relationship with the world around you. So how do you get started? So your prescription for natural movement. We already started right now. We already started, right? By putting yourself on the ground, you moved far more while we had this presentation than you would have otherwise. You shifted positions regularly. You may have gone from cross-legged to sitting with your legs up to the side to straddle. All those positions are actually physical nourishments that your body needs. And if you find yourself really uncomfortable and unable to sustain those positions, that's a really strong signal that your body's missing something that it really needs. There's a school of physical therapy which bases your longevity prospectus off of how well you can get up and back down off the ground, right? We have an epidemic of falling in the elderly here, and people getting badly injured. We have a terrible relationship with the ground. Have you ever heard a doctor, a physical trainer say, you're not supposed to bend your knees below 90 degrees? It's bizarre, right? Well, I mean, in every other culture in the world, people toilet on the ground and eat on the ground and have to get down on the ground to sleep. Like, how is it that we're just dysfunctional through the majority of the range of motion of our knees and ankles?
Well, a baseball catcher has to do that too.
We're dysfunctional because we have a culture that never asks us to go there, right? And when we accidentally go there, now it's a disaster. Now you can get really badly hurt by it. So practicing this is a really fundamental thing. I don't sit at a chair if I can avoid it in my work life, right? I sit on the ground because automatically I'm going to be stimulating more mobility. I'm going to be moving through more positions. It's going to be more metabolically taxing every time I have to get up off the ground, burning more calories, any number of positive effects just from that. This is one of the big missing movement nutrients. The other one is walking, right? If you wanted to get anywhere in the past, you had to walk. Most of human evolution. You should walk 2 to 3 miles a day. And if you can walk in nature, obviously, you're getting all the benefits of nature. Moving through a natural environment is going to be the best. If we can walk barefoot, your feet need to become strong. They need to adapt. The foot is the foundation of the body, and we have no condition for it. We just hide them in shoes and let them, How many of you guys can lift your big toe independently? And let's see if I can do that. There we go. Should be able to play piano with your toes. You need that primal squat, right? This pattern's so important. Find time to practice this every day. You need to be able to hang from your shoulders. Right? The natural cultivation of all of your overhead range of motion is hanging. We evolved as hanging animals, or brachiating apes. When the shoulder doesn't get the stimulation of going overhead, upper body starts to degrade, weakness, poor posture, kyphosis, shoulder pain, impingement. You need this. Take your time developing it, but it's something that you need to be able to do. Start building your movement skills in nature. Right? Go out and play in the natural world. Obviously, I think the best thing you can do to get started with that is to come to one of my seminars. I've been doing this for 10 years. I've made a lot of mistakes along the way that you guys don't have to make. I've gone and studied with many great coaches to try and fill in this method. I've tried to go as deeply into my personal practice as possible. So it's a really rich place to come and learn about how you can approach moving like a human being. But even if you can't come to a seminar this weekend, I have tons of resources online. You can start researching what I've done. If you send me an email, I'll happily answer the emails you have about getting started with this. I have many friends who are doing similar things, so I can point you to their work as well. I've got an online Evolved Move Play group on Facebook you guys can join and ask questions and be involved in the community. So there's no reason you can't start your practice tomorrow or even today. Right? Go and climb a tree after the seminar. Don't wait until you feel like you're fit. This is the biggest mistake that people make. We still have this concept that we have to be fit to do the things that we love. And it's backwards. Your natural motivation system for movement is play. Right? So when you say, I'm going to be able to do that thing that I like once I do all this drudgery stuff that I hate, you just never get there. If you can find the things that you love, that you absolutely adore doing, that's movement, and it will make you fit. And it will give you motivation to take care of all the other things that get in the way. We do live in a culture where you need to rehabilitate your body to be able to do some of the types of play that you see. If you see my videos and you see me jumping between tree branches, you don't start there. There's a lot of things that you have to build to get you there. But if you start with what you can do and you enjoy the process, then you're willing to make the sacrifices to take care of your body and get where you need to go. So start with what you love. So, yeah, we need to bring back love, joy, play into movement. We need to move like human beings. And we should start the process as soon as possible. So that's my spiel for you guys today. If you have questions, I'd love to answer any questions, talk to you guys about anything that comes up for you. And that's all we've got. Thank you.
Will you be doing a movement seminar here anytime soon in Victoria?
I am. I'm teaching a movement seminar on Saturday and Sunday. So Brad has sign-ups set up downstairs. You can sign up for the seminar. And yeah.
When's your next time around, do you know, by chance?
In Victoria?
Yeah.
Probably not until 2017, but Seattle and Bellingham are not that far away. It took me a long time to get here, but you take the ferry down. I have a 5-day seminar coming up in August. I play at these amazing trees. You're going to slide down slopes. Dan's been to it, so you can ask Dan about it. It's a really amazing experience. Highly recommend it. So that would be the next one to look at.
Cool.
What's your view on yoga and how complete or incomplete it is as a movement?
It's a big question. I mean, so broadly, yoga is incomplete in the sense that you're indoors, right?
No.
A lot of the time, right? Yeah. I mean, in the thing. Are you climbing? Right? Are you interacting with other people physically? Are you fighting? Are you hitting each other? No, there's a lot of things that are great about yoga. Like I think that yoga helps people develop a relationship with the ground. Like just for most people, just
Going into like a downward dog position, that's supremely challenging.
that should be very normal. Right? Yoga is a very diverse subject. Right? What is yoga originally? Yoga originally is primarily meditation. Right? It was oriented towards pranayama, towards breath work and meditation to achieve enlightenment. Hatha yoga, most of the poses are relatively recently developed, and they were originally developed to help you sit. Right? So you needed the physical strength and mobility to sit effectively for a prolonged period of time. So I think there's great stuff in yoga. I think there's some amazing coaches in yoga. It's a huge community. There's also a lot of myopia in yoga, where people are very focused on their little box and are threatened by what's outside of it, and don't have, it's not a complete movement, but it is a beautiful source of movement culture that people can learn a lot from. It's something that I actually would like to study a little bit more and kind of find some great teachers to learn more about that.
I just thought it was kind of cool when you were talking about play and children and stuff, and it just related to a video I watched the other day on how Finland has the best education in the world. As we all know, Finns do things really well. And their kids are in school for the least amount of time during the day. They have just like a couple hours of school a day, and most of the day the kids are just outside interacting with other kids in the trees, playing in nature. And they're ranked best education, best kids in the world. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Finland scores, actually, I think it's second best behind Japan
okay.
a lot of the time.
Okay.
And interestingly, Japan has a very different education system. But Finland's really interesting. This is a particular passion of mine. I have 2 small children, and I'm trying to figure out. Okay, good. So my understanding of the Finnish system is that for every 45 minutes of class time, children earn 15 minutes of outdoor time.
Yeah.
It's they don't start formal education until children are 7 years old, and they almost all walk to school too, even though it's really cold in Finland. And I think that's brilliant. I think there's an enormous amount to learn from that. It's awesome. So that's what I'm sending my daughter to a forest preschool next year. So yeah, there's lots of interesting things about it. There's a huge push in the States right now for pre-K and academic pre-Ks, and it's unfortunate that they're not looking at the research. Like the most recent research is finding that kids who go to academic pre-Ks are more likely to have alcohol abuse and drug abuse problems. They have lower scores coming out. They have higher scores going into like 3rd grade, but they have lower scores going into college, and they have all sorts of abortion problems. It's very unnatural to ask 3-year-olds to sit still for long periods of time. My daycare provider, who works with my daughter, she is under pressure to provide academic lessons of 45 minutes to 2-year-olds, and to have some kind of academic lessons for anyone over 6 years old. So she's supposed to do specific motor coordination drills with anybody. It's crazy times right now.
Just a couple of weeks ago, I was staying down here on the porch, and I was gifted a book called The Human Zoo by Desmond Morris by a a retired professor from Simon Fraser at UBC. He said, read this, it's very applicable, and it sounded very familiar to what you were saying, and compared anything that gets put in captivity, whether it's a wild animal or anything, put it in a natural environment, it gets all of these diseases that don't exist in the wild, such as heart disease and all this kind of stuff, depression, they call it the human zoo of the city and stuff like that. But have you found any research that looks at either specific animals and how different their environment would be in a zoo versus outside, and then the amount of that difference does it correlate to any diseases and stuff, and how that would relate to humans, and do different city structures and stuff? Is there a lot of research that shows, or any research that shows how a city is built, and all that kind of stuff, and how it relates to the well-being?
It's an interesting question. So I don't have a perfect answer to that. There's one thing that a theme in there that I want to get into, but the idea of how the city impacts people, I think is really profound. I have a friend called Alex Biko, who's here in Canada, who's researching that a lot about kind of how we move through cities and how those can affect us. My wife's actually really interested in this, and how we can create better spaces to get people to engage with their environments. She has a blog called Mental Flowers, if you want to check it out. It's not as much in my wheelhouse. The one thing I will say was something I want to talk about in the talk that I didn't get to is when I was talking about my mentor's family and how they had kind of had this accumulation of problems over generations. There's some really interesting research about addiction, about how it has to do with environmental, sort of the opposite of environmental nourishment, environmental impoverishment. So it's done in rat models, but what they found was that essentially if you put a rat in a standard laboratory environment and you give it access to cocaine, it will become addicted to cocaine. If you take the same rats and you create the most engaging, awesome, most natural-like environment for the rats, so they have tons of places to play, they've got tons of green space, they can have lots of sex, they don't get addicted. Right? So a lot of the problems that we have as a culture, there's a good chance that essentially the zoo-human syndrome is one of the roots of those problems, and that by becoming broader, more competent human beings and really kind of going for the same environmental enrichment that we need to provide zoo animals, we can really be healthier human beings. So another reason to go play in the trees.
Has your philosophy of movement caused you to change your mind about comfy chairs and plush beds and that kind of thing in your home?
Yeah,
some rocks.
So Katie Bowman, who I said I was a big fan of, she does no furniture basically,
Right.
and I think that's really cool. I do have couches in my house and I do have a bed. I don't work on my couches. I try to avoid working on my couches, so I use my couches like a special treat for when I'm really physically exhausted. And then with my bed, I work on training myself to sleep on hard surfaces. It's actually like a training that I do. But
It's Japanese style.
yeah, with so another one of my good friends is Kelly Starrett. He really advocates really soft beds for athletes. This is chronically an overextension and pushing our bodies so hard that it's very easy for us to lose sleep quality and kind of break down. So Katie actually talks a lot about the need to very slowly transition to that heart. You need ranges of motion that you don't have right now in order to sleep well on a hard surface. So I'm not at that point where I can do that. After a really hard day of training, I need a soft bed basically to sleep well. And I'm trying to open up that thoracic chain, right? So the big problem that people have, so the closest thing to Flop's fin syndrome in modern human beings is probably kyphosis. If you look at spines of tribal people, they're much less S-curved than ours are. So when you go to lay down and lay your head on the ground, if you have a kyphotic spine, then your head has to go a much farther distance. So you create a much more flexion or extension in your neck, and much more like a pinch and irritate the nerves. So if you can really open that back up, now all of a sudden, this is much easier. So that range of motion, whether you have it or not, actually determines whether you're healthy to take on a harder surface and harder bed.
I was chatting with my friend the other day who's a physiotherapist, and I think he was just sort of musing about this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. He works with a lot of athletes who are wrecked, right? We physically injure ourselves so often, and he says, I wonder, evolutionarily, have we been pushing ourselves until we are knackered? You go out and you run a marathon and you physically collapse, you fall down, right? And so you're talking about training, you're training really hard, and then you need to go sleep on yourself, So how hard should we be training, on a regular basis? I mean, we want to be strong so that we can go out and fight the tiger when we need to, but should we be fighting the tiger every day,
Probably less hard than a lot of athletes.
Yeah.
So I'm actually dealing with some chronic overtraining fatigue issues myself right now, and I'm working with a coach who works with a lot of CrossFit athletes, and he sees just a tremendous amount of this. So going 100% all out, the tiger is chasing me, I'm gonna do this until I puke or fall apart every day, is definitely not natural, right? The reason that a lot of athletes chase intensity, there's two reasons why we kind of have fallen into the trap of thinking intensity is everything in exercise. One is that intensity gives a lot of effect in a short amount of time, right? We are all busy and have lives that require a lot of us. So if I say to you, hey, you can get all the benefits of a physical practice in 15 minutes, that's a really nice offer in the Western world. Unfortunately, it doesn't work forever, and it can really hurt you on the back end when you are chasing that level of intensity. The other thing is that we become addicted to it, right? We become addicted to that intensity. There are neurohormonal effects that happen when you push yourself super hard, and that can actually become its own form of addiction. So if we have lives that are not enriched in that broader cultural sense, we can actually become dependent on exercise in the same way that we can be dependent on anything else. So I think there's actually a lot of chronic over-exercising in our culture. So there's this weird balance where most people have way too little, and then the people who have enough have way too much.
I just had a quick note when you were talking about visiting your families, or the family, and you said all of them could all play music and stuff, and that everyone was pretty good at musical instruments. And I'm a music teacher, and I find that I teach piano and voice, and I have a couple kids who take singing lessons, and I teach a couple adults. And it's completely different, because my students who are kids are just so open and willing, and then I teach these singing students who are adults, and it's like they've got a wall up, and they're afraid to sing. And I think that's a really important thing for music. I really truly believe that everyone's born with this innate passion for music, and that kids just love singing. We kind of drop it as we grow up, and it leaves us, and so I see a huge difference for music in kids versus adults, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, kids and adults are not the same, right? It's an interesting thing anytime we talk. It's when I talk about movement, and I talk about the analogy of play, I think that there's a lot of power in it. There's also a potential to be slightly misled, because adults and children are not only dissimilar because of culture, right? We have a tendency to think of things that we see in children, differences that we see in children as innate, and things that develop later as not innate. But secondary sexual characteristics develop in your teens, and it's not because of culture, right? So there are these things that change. I think that ultimately the way that an individual plays over their lifespan should be a little bit different, but it's really hard to get at that. Kids are more open. They learn languages much easier, and I think that to some degree singing is probably like that. Also, kids have more flexible self-identities, and I think this is something that we could all cultivate. Right? We all have stories that we tell about ourselves, and those stories are really powerful, and they're often get in conflict with our goals. I want to become a singer, I want to be good at singing, but I've told myself 100,000 times that I'm not a singer and I'm not good at singing. And so when you try, any failure confirms the narrative, and a kid doesn't have that.
Yeah, it's cool. My son is just barely starting to speak, but he hums tunes and like says bow 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 bow, like, and you'll hear like, oh, that's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, or that's the song that they sing at his sister's dance class. And it's really amazing to see it. But his older sister took him much longer to be able to start replicating melody, right?
Yeah.
He's starting to replicate melody at 18, 19, 20 months old. She didn't start, she was singing, she was trying to sing, but she didn't actually achieve any sort of melody
Yeah.
until she was like 2.5.
Yeah.
And do you know anything about the difference, like the different, maybe perhaps like neurological pathways between music and non-music? Like, for example, like with people with Parkinson's, where they're not able to walk, and then when they hear music, they can walk.
I don't. That's a great question. That's a really interesting thing. Music is definitely not one of my kind of primary areas of study. I'm one of those guys whose self-image is like totally not musically competent. I sing because I'm a human being. I just generally don't inflict it on other people.
I'm curious, when you have a workshop with someone, what is the most frequent movement that has been erased outside of that squat movement that people need to cultivate more? Which one would that be?
Overhead range of motion. You know, the shoulder is really, you know, there's a lot, right? Like wrists, people can't go here and here, they're stuck here. Like with parkour athletes, a lot of time they have elbow pain. Anyone who's trying to turn a muscle up, have you ever had any of that medial elbow issue?
Only on the left.
Oh, I don't know. There we go. So generally, if you have elbow pain, it's because you're missing, the most common cause of elbow pain is because you're missing internal rotation of the shoulder. So you get to here, as you're trying to do your muscle up, and your shoulder glides forward. What happens is that the nerve that flows through there, the brachial nerve, the slack gets taken out of it, and all of a sudden it's getting jammed into the ulna right here. So you have this little ulnar irritation. So that's a really common one that I'm fixing with athletes, is dealing with their lack of internal rotation at the shoulder. Lack of dorsiflexion in the ankle, which is part of the squat, lack of hip flexion, and lack of overhead, right? Like I would say 99% of people that I see don't have normal shoulder rotation, shoulder range of motion. Like if you try to, my shoulder range of motion is okay, but it needs to be a little bit improved too. So as I go up here, I should be able to reach the top here and go past it without my rib cage flaring. So you'll see that I come to a point where all of a sudden it's not the glenohumeral joint moving anymore, it's the thoracic. So you'll see a lot of people who are here and they're like, oh yeah, now I'm overhead. Totally, bro. Right, so that ability to get here is really important. And when we don't have that ability, when we try to start swinging and hanging and doing pull-ups and doing overhead barbell work, a lot of times that's where you get an impingement in the shoulder. So it's something that's really important to cultivate.
I'm just kind of curious how you would like approach people when you're like working with an individual, like, because you were talking about like squatting and how the knee isn't prepared, even though the quads might be strong or whatever. Do you really avoid any sort of isolation, or will you recognize, like a person's shoulders need work, so I'm going to do some stuff specifically to this, this, and this, or do you just like, we're going to crawl, we're going to climb, we're going to, like, do you assume it'll correct?
I think that we are in a rehabilitative phase with just about any human being who comes through movement practice right now. And so you try to get them engaged in the practice and the things that they can't already do. And then you go back and start asking, how do we deal with the structures that are limiting you? So I put out a video about how to get started with natural movement practice this week. And one of the things we talked about was play with a squat, right? So everybody, how many of you guys here have trained your squat? Right? Everybody, okay. So how many times is your squat thinking, I need to have this exact, okay, so I have to have a perfect position of my back, My knee needs to be directly over my toes. My feet have to be slightly over shoulders width apart. I'm going to descend down here. Okay, that's your squat. Right? That is one small part of an enormous spectrum of movement. Right? And it's the optimal way maybe to have a barbell on your back. That's great. But there's a lot of the tissues that are not being trained, a lot of the positions that are not being trained by being sort of myopic and looking at only that position. So one of the drills that I like to do with people, if you don't mind if I borrow you for a second, you don't have to have a partner for this, but just step back just a little bit. So I'm going to squat down, and using squatting, sitting, kind of anything on the ground, I'm just going to point at him, and I want him to move around. Just move. Right? And this is a great drill that's going to take me through all these different positions, right? But now, if I'm watching anyone do this, I'm going to start trying to observe which are the joints that are not functioning well, right? So that they are not having the freedom and ability to move healthfully in the way that I want. And so I'll go back and say, okay, for me, I'm really lacking in dorsiflexion of the ankle, right? For my demands anyways. So that's about 7 to 10 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion.
It's not too bad.
Okay. Optimal athletically is supposed to be 25. When you look at hunter forager tribes who climb trees a lot, you find they have about 45 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion. Yeah.
Really? So they're like here.
Yeah. Right. If you want, climbing trees is my thing, right? So I really want this ability to like. So if I'm trying to climb my tree over here, the more foot that I can get over there while maintaining this shin position, the more traction I have and the more strength that I have to apply to the tree. So this is a really important thing to me. In addition, when I'm lacking it, it means that when I take big landings, it's harder to land softly and keep all the other joints in position that I want. I've sprained each of my ankles severely 8 times, and I've torn my Achilles on this side. I sprained my ankles when I was in my teens playing basketball. So it's that joint has a lot of bad history that causes it to be more likely to be seized up. And I've made these muscles pretty strong with different strength training programs, and it's harder to change a strong muscle than a weak muscle. I squatted 355 pounds and deadlifted 440 pounds, so it takes a big stimulus to make the muscle think, hey, I need to change. So the way that I train this joint is I put 135 pounds on a barbell and rest the barbell on the end of my femurs and squat down and sit here for 2 minutes, and then I try to do an isometric, I try to do a calf raise basically in that position, but the weight's too much for my foot to actually come up, so it's an isometric calf raise exercise at that end range of motion. And then when I do 20 seconds of that, then I'll do 20 seconds of trying to pull my shin towards my foot using all the muscles in the anterior side of my shin. And I'll do that for 3 sets, right? That's very strong medicine, and it's not very much fun. It's not very playful, but it's what I need to do the stuff that I want to do, to be better at the stuff that I want to do. So it's worthwhile for me. And you won't necessarily need an intervention that's that extreme to gain something that you want. Right? This is the most dysfunctional joint in my body, reinforced by years and years of hard physical practice. And this is the tool that I'm using to overcome that. But yeah, so any athlete that I'm working with, we have the fun stuff and the playful stuff and how we get them to engage with their bodies. And then we have how we can isolate the areas that are dysfunctional and start trying to feed them the capacity that they need.
How do you know, say for example with your movement, I think there's a yoga video named Paul Grilly is his name, and he talks about tensile compression, he talks about bone compression, how movements from our anatomies are different. Some hips are 0 degrees, 3 degrees, 33 degrees. So like in your case, when you're trying to build this range of motion, or watching somebody else for that matter, how do you know when there is that end point with where you've reached? Is it bone compression? Is it tensile compression?
Yeah, so it's
Because there's an end point for all of us. Like, could all of us achieve this degree you're talking about?
45 degrees
Like-
of ankle compression. So this is a really interesting and difficult question. A good friend of mine, Todd Hargrove, is a great author. He's got a book called Better Movement, if you guys are interested in checking it out. And he and I are always talking about this, because the truth is that we really can't know perfectly. We don't, even if we can go in and take an image of the underlying tissue, it's not a perfect representation of what's happening in vivo. My philosophy is, as much as possible, we want to believe that we can achieve change, because our beliefs are powerful. And as soon as we adopt a mindset that change is impossible, change is impossible.
How long have you been chasing the 45? You know, is there a point, not necessarily where you'll give up, you just kind of realize that this is your end point, you know?
Yeah, so there's always, you're always making decisions about kind of costs and benefits of your program, right? So whenever I do that protocol that I'm telling you about, it helps me and I get better, or I reclaim motion that I've lost. But my life is happening, other things are happening, so I don't always make the time to do that. So there are certain things to achieve with your body that you may not have the capital to expend, right? So maybe everyone can be a contortionist, but maybe for some people it means 10 hours a day of extremely hard, torturous training. Is that worth it to you?
Do you have a routine to hold full body mobility, or do you just do it intuitively?
What's that?
Do you have a routine to hold your full body mobility, like you're saying right now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I notice that all the time, but do you do it? I do it intuitively.
yeah, my approach personally is fairly intuitive at this stage. I've been doing it for a very long time. I know what my primary needs are, and my belief is that we have an internal understanding of movement. We have an internal intuitive system to understand movement. Right? Just like we should eat based on appetite in the long run, we should move based on movement appetites in the long run. I think that many of us are essentially, we're very deranged in our ability to understand those. So we need to feed ourselves these more kind of strict programs for a long time and slowly build that intuitive side. So with all my athletes, like they have like a strict joint integrity program for a while. And then I'm always kind of pinging them, and they're pinging me on how that feels for them, and then they'll say, hey, I experimented with this. And I'll say, okay, cool, well, how did that make you feel? Did that work for you? Let's see how that works down the road. And over time, as the athletes mature in the process becomes more and more intuitive. And if you look at really good coaches in gymnastics or track and field or martial arts, you'll see this trend over and over again. With novices, the tendency is to have a fairly strict set of kind of approaches, because novices don't have a very good kind of intrinsic understanding, and they adapt fairly well. With elite athletes, you have to be very attuned to their personal response. They have a very good guide to how their body works, and a small dose of too much has a huge negative impact on them. It's hard to overtrain a novice. It's very easy to overtrain a highly trained athlete.
This is a question both as like a strength coach that believes in primal movement, but also just a Seahawks fan. Like you're saying, your student is a trainer for the Hawks. Where are they doing anything involved with primal movements or fundamental movement patterns that you?
Not really, no. I mean, he's the physical therapist and assistant in clinic. Yeah. And I mean, so he does some interesting stuff. There's a problem in the NFL right now, which is that the staff, the physical training staff, is viewed as part of management by the athletes. So the athletes are often very resistant to anything that the physical training staff wants them to do. So you have to kind of meet them where their expectations are and at the things that they like. And so it's hard to get compliance from NFL athletes to do whatever you want. It's not easy to kind of introduce new things to them. Like basically, he's really upset right now because like half the team is doing CrossFit in the off-season.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you.
He probably calls
falls heavy into that addiction. They're so used to running at that kind of, that level. How can you just walk away from that, say, come summertime? CrossFit kind of feeds that beast pretty good.
Yeah.
Just thinking about how you said some of the movements are more natural, or some of the practices that we currently use have stemmed from what we naturally have done in the past. You were talking about that. So I think of things that seem right, that there is no connection to the past, or maybe there is and I can't make the link, like a trampoline, or like even rings. I see those as extremely beneficial, knowing that nature is the goal, but it's like, well, are there any tools that somebody can have around them that make it quick and easy, just to keep them in the meantime before they can get out to nature? Are there any tools that you highly recommend that most people need that could be in and around the house that are easy, quick, or you can even make yourself or something?
So, we have to be careful with the way that we think about natural. What's natural isn't necessarily optimal, or even good, right? Like, understanding what's natural helps us understand what is good and optimal for us. But, like, natural is that 30% of your friends are killed, murdered, right? That's not good. It's much better that we live in an artificial system that doesn't allow that, right? Natural is dying at 55. So natural isn't always great, right? Arsenic is natural. The thing I just talked about with putting a barbell on my knees and doing that's totally unnatural. That's insane. Like, it's nobody would intuitively say this is a great idea. I would love doing it, right? All the joint integrity work that I do, basically, I think is basically boring and not fun and not something anyone would ever do in a natural situation, but it's something that we need to make up for the stuff that we've missed. So something like trampolines, I think of trampolines as steroids for air awareness. And like steroids, they do have costs. They're not very big costs, but the way that your body orients to force can be disrupted by a trampoline. People in gymnastics have high rates of knee issues because the elastic element always bends in the middle, which means that the knees tend to track medially, right? So if you're putting a lot of time into a trampoline, you're actually just kind of training your body to have a force response that allows that knee tracking issue. Right? Now, that's okay if you're doing a lot of other good stuff and nourishing your body. And if you are trying to make up for not having any acrobatic background when you're in your 20s, like, it's an incredible tool. Right? Like, I have a trampoline in my backyard, and I think it's awesome. I have rings in my garage, and rings are really interesting because they have that free swimming aspect and the control aspect. There's things that are missed, right? Like, it's easier to get the rings around your chest than to get your chest around a tree branch. And the rings are unstable this way, but they're not unstable this way. Right? When you're on a tree branch, the tree branch bends, right? And it bends more on one side than another. So this is something that kinesthetically you have to solve. So it's not necessarily better, right? They're both good challenges for the nervous system. In general, the challenges that derive from the natural world are more complex, and so they're more nourishing for the body.
You know, I've always been fascinated by the way that different cultures have different methods of carrying like a heavy load.
Yeah.
Have you gained any insights from that?
You know, it's something I would like to study more. You know, I've been very focused on how the body locomotes itself through space in different cultures.